Dr. George Nicopoulos spent a lot of time here at Graceland. He was a medical doctor first, but his life became defined by Elvis and Elvis's troubles.
For 48 years, one part of Graceland remained completely off-limits, hidden behind a door that fans could only wonder about. But now, Elvis Presley's attic has reportedly been opened, exposing a side of the king that few ever knew existed. What was discovered inside was not simply forgotten memorabilia. There were deeply personal traces of Elvis, and one discovery raises an unsettling question. Who or what had been waiting there all this time? The door Elvis never let the public see. When Elvis Presley bought Graceland in 1957, he was only 22 years old, but his life was already changing at a speed few could imagine. He paid $102,500 for the Memphis estate, transforming what had once been a wealthy family home into his own private kingdom. For a young man who had grown up in modest circumstances in Tupelo, Mississippi, Graceland represented more than success. It was proof that everything had changed. At first, the mansion was filled with life. Elvis brought his parents there, kept horses on the property, and even had an unusual chimpanzee named Scatter, whose behavior became legendary among guests. Yet behind the spectacle was another side of Elvis that rarely appeared in public. One of his favorite places was the meditation garden, where he could step away from screaming fans and the constant demands of fame. Inside the mansion, every room seemed to reveal another part of his personality. The jungle room reflected his extravagant taste, while the basement television room allowed him to watch several programs at once. Even the racquetball court became a place where Elvis could relax, play music, and spend time with friends. Then everything changed on August 16, 1977. After Elvis died, Graceland stopped being simply a family home. It became a place of mourning, memory, and eventually, pilgrimage. His father, Vernon Presley, took extraordinary precautions after concerns about the security of Elvis's original grave, and the family worked to protect the property and everything inside it. When Graceland opened to the public in 1982, fans could walk through many of the rooms Elvis had once occupied. They could see his clothes, his furniture, his personal spaces, and pieces of the extraordinary life he had built. But one place remained completely different. The staircase leading to the second floor was blocked. Visitors could look toward it, but they could go no farther. The explanation was always the same. The upstairs was private and would remain that way out of respect for the Presley family. That simple barrier only made the mystery more powerful. For decades, millions of people wondered what remained behind that closed door. Was it simply a preserved piece of Elvis's private life? Or were there memories the family never wanted the public to see? And there was an even darker reason that upstairs became so closely guarded. To understand why that door stayed closed for nearly 5 decades, we have to go back to the final afternoon of Elvis Presley's life. What happened upstairs? On August 16, 1977. By the afternoon of August 16th, Elvis Presley had already spent years living under an unusual routine. His nights could stretch into the early morning, while the daylight hours were often reserved for sleep. To the people around him, that schedule was nothing unusual. But on this particular day, the quiet inside Graceland would soon become terrifying. Elvis was upstairs, resting in his bedroom, while the mansion carried on around him. His fiancée, Ginger Alden, eventually woke and expected that he would still be nearby. Yet, as the afternoon progressed, something about the silence began to feel wrong. Around 2:30 p.m., Alden went to check on him. She knocked on the bathroom door, but received no response. When she entered, she found Elvis unconscious on the floor, with his pajama bottoms around his ankles. Within moments, the atmosphere inside Graceland changed completely. Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's closest friends and road manager, rushed upstairs and attempted to revive him. Emergency services were contacted, and paramedics arrived at the estate before transporting Elvis to Baptist Memorial Hospital. They continued desperate efforts to save him, but nothing worked. At 3:30 p.m., Elvis Presley was pronounced dead.
Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently, it was a heart attack.
He was only 42. The shock was immediate. Radio stations interrupted their programs, television networks rushed out reports, and fans gathered around Graceland trying to process what seemed impossible. The man who had spent 2 decades defining rock and roll was suddenly gone. Officials initially attributed his death to cardiac arrhythmia, an abnormality of the heart's rhythm. But that explanation did not end the questions. Elvis had been struggling with serious health problems for years, and his physical condition had become increasingly difficult to hide. His weight had risen dramatically. Some later performances showed a performer who appeared exhausted, struggled with his movements, or seemed to lose his concentration. The contrast was disturbing. The same entertainer who once seemed unstoppable was visibly struggling behind the spectacle. Then came the toxicology findings. Several medications and substances were detected in Elvis's system, including codeine, Demerol, Dilaudid, Percodan, and Quaaludes. The discovery intensified scrutiny of the treatment he had received and fueled a much larger debate over what had contributed to his decline. For the Presley family, however, the tragedy was far more personal. The upstairs rooms were now permanently connected to Elvis's final moments. Protecting that part of Graceland meant protecting memories that were painful enough without millions of strangers looking inside. Yet the questions surrounding Elvis's final years were not going to disappear. Soon, attention turned toward the physician who had been treating him for more than a decade. His name was George Nichopoulos, better known as Dr. Nick, and the record of medications connected to Elvis would become one of the most controversial chapters in the King's story. The man who controlled Elvis's medicine. Behind Elvis Presley's declining health was a complicated relationship that would remain controversial long after his death.
Has brought up new curiosity about his relationship with Memphis's biggest legend and the scandal surrounding those final days.
At the center of it was Dr. George Nichopoulos, the physician known to Elvis and those around him as Dr. Nick. Nichopoulos began treating Elvis in 1967 and eventually became far more than a doctor who appeared during routine appointments. He traveled with the singer, shared time with his entourage, and became closely involved in managing the medications Elvis received. Then the numbers began to raise eyebrows. During the final 8 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick reportedly prescribed nearly 200 prescriptions containing more than 10,000 pills, capsules, and vials. The previous year, the total had reportedly approached 19,000 doses. Elvis was receiving medication so frequently that, on average, it amounted to more than one prescription every day. Friends also recalled Elvis carrying large quantities of medication with him, sometimes with enough bottles to resemble a traveling pharmacy. To critics, the situation seemed indefensible. How could a physician allow such an enormous supply to accumulate around a patient whose health was visibly deteriorating? Dr. Nick had a different explanation. He maintained that Elvis was dealing with legitimate medical problems, including chronic pain, glaucoma, and colitis. He also argued that his role was to control the situation rather than abandon Elvis to seek medications elsewhere. In his view, refusing to prescribe could have pushed the singer toward even more dangerous sources. But after Elvis died, that defense came under intense scrutiny. In 1980, Nichopoulos was indicted on 14 counts involving the excessive prescribing of controlled substances to Elvis and other patients. And prosecutors portrayed him as a physician who had gone far beyond responsible medical care. Yet, the jury ultimately acquitted him, accepting the argument that Elvis might have obtained the substances regardless. The controversy did not end there. In 1995, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners permanently revoked Nichopoulos's medical license. By then, public opinion had largely transformed Dr. Nick into one of the most controversial figures connected to Elvis's final years. But there was another possibility that complicated the story. In 2020, Author Sally A. Hodel argued in her book Destined to Die Young that Elvis's decline may not have been caused by medication dependence alone.
Sally Hodel is a lifelong Elvis enthusiast and the author of a new book, Elvis, Destined to Die Young.
She pointed to inherited medical conditions, including alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which can affect the liver and lungs. Other health problems may also have contributed to the pain, fatigue, infections, and breathing difficulties Elvis experienced. That possibility doesn't erase the concerns surrounding his medication, but it suggests that the story of Elvis's decline may have been far more complicated than a simple tale of reckless prescribing. And while experts debated what had actually happened to the king, millions of fans were asking an entirely different question. What if Elvis Presley's story had not really ended on August 16, 1977? That question would soon give birth to one of the most persistent celebrity mysteries ever created: the Elvis Lives mystery. Elvis Presley may have been declared dead, but for some fans, that was only the beginning of the story. Almost immediately after his death, disbelief turned into speculation. People who could not accept that the king was gone began claiming that Elvis had secretly disappeared and was living somewhere beyond the reach of the public. What started as whispers soon became a worldwide phenomenon. One of the earliest stories involved a man who allegedly purchased a plane ticket from Memphis to Buenos Aires using the name John Burroughs, a pseudonym associated with Elvis. Other supposed sightings followed. A woman in Michigan claimed she encountered Elvis while being served at a Burger King. Before long, reports placed him everywhere from gas stations to grocery stores. The stories became so widespread that Elvis sightings developed their own strange culture. Tabloids fed the fascination, with publications such as Weekly World News running recurring coverage dedicated to alleged appearances. Some theories became even more elaborate, claiming Elvis had entered witness protection or had deliberately staged his death. Graceland only added fuel to the speculation. The upstairs remained closed, leaving an enormous unanswered space inside the most famous Elvis property in the world. Fans could tour much of the mansion, but they could not cross that final boundary. For believers, the locked staircase became another reason to wonder whether the Presley family was hiding something. Then, there were the details surrounding Elvis's death that conspiracy theorists repeatedly pointed to. Questions circulated about the reported weight of his casket, the appearance of his body, and even the spelling of his middle name on his gravestone. To skeptics, these details were easily explained. To believers, they became pieces of a much larger theory. The Elvis Lives legend never completely disappeared. But decades later, Graceland faced a real threat that had nothing to do with sightings or conspiracy theories. In 2024, a little-known company called Nosany Investments and Private Lending, LLC, claimed that Riley Keough, Elvis's granddaughter and heir to the estate, had failed to repay millions of dollars in loans. The company sought to move forward with a sale of Graceland, sending shockwaves through the Presley fan community. The claim quickly attracted national attention, raising questions about the estate's finances and whether the iconic Memphis property could actually be taken away from the Presley family. Keough's legal team fought back, arguing that the documents behind the claim were fraudulent. An emergency court proceeding followed, and a judge suspended the proposed sale, describing Graceland as a unique cultural treasure whose loss could cause irreparable harm. The alleged lender did not appear in court to defend its claim. Graceland remained in the Presley family's hands, but the incident served as a powerful reminder. Protecting Elvis's legacy was no longer simply about keeping fans away from a locked staircase. The family had to confront how vulnerable the estate could become. And then came the moment that had seemed impossible for generations. A door that had remained closed for nearly 5 decades was finally about to open. After 48 years, the door finally moved. For generations, that staircase had represented a boundary no ordinary Graceland visitor could cross. Then, according to the story, everything changed in January 2025. Archivists reportedly entered the long-sealed upper area carrying gloves and preservation equipment, preparing to examine a space that had supposedly remained untouched since the final days of Elvis Presley's life. After decades of speculation, the door was finally opened. What they reportedly encountered was not the neglected storage room many might have imagined. The space was described as surprisingly preserved, with blackout curtains covering the dormer windows and an air conditioning system still functioning to protect the contents inside. The contrast was striking. While other parts of Graceland had become public exhibits visited by countless fans, this hidden area appeared to have remained a private time capsule. Then came the boxes. They were reportedly organized according to different chapters of Elvis's life, with labels referencing periods such as Tupelo 1945, Army Days, Hollywood, Comeback Special, and Vegas. Instead of random belongings thrown into an attic, the collection seemed carefully arranged, almost like someone had deliberately created a private archive of the King's journey. The first discoveries made the story even more personal. One box reportedly contained a worn teddy bear associated with Elvis's childhood and his mother, Gladys. Another included a Bible connected to his military years, reinforced with tape and filled with markings and notes. These weren't the glamorous objects fans normally associate with Elvis Presley. They pointed toward the private individual beneath the jumpsuits, cameras, and screaming crowds. Other reported items offered an even more intimate glimpse into Elvis's private world. A leather jacket connected to Jailhouse Rock allegedly contained a handwritten message about disappearing when necessary, suggesting thoughts he may have kept hidden from those around him. Meanwhile, books concerning spirituality, mortality, and the afterlife reportedly revealed how deeply Elvis had wrestled with questions that extended far beyond fame, success, and celebrity. But the objects were only part of what made the discovery so intriguing. The deeper the archivists went, the clearer it became that this wasn't simply a collection of forgotten possessions. There were signs that the space had been maintained over the years. The equipment had not simply been abandoned, and the boxes were reportedly orderly rather than covered in decades of neglect. Someone had seemingly preserved this hidden corner. But the most extraordinary discovery had not yet been revealed. Among the carefully stored belongings was something that could do what photographs and objects never could. It could bring Elvis himself back into the room. And when the recording began to play, nearly 5 decades of silence were about to disappear. The final secret of Elvis's attic. The most powerful discovery in the attic was not something that could be displayed behind glass. It was something that could still be heard. Among the reported contents were reel-to-reel tapes labeled Practice Sessions 1976. For decades, they had remained hidden alongside the other personal belongings connected to Elvis Presley. Now, when the recordings were reportedly played, the silence of the room was replaced by a voice that millions of people around the world had once known instantly. Elvis was singing again. One recording was said to contain a stripped-down version of Unchained Melody, recorded only months before his death. There was no roaring audience, no elaborate stage production, and none of the spectacle that had surrounded so much of his career. Instead, the recording reportedly captured a much more vulnerable performer. His voice sounded tired, intimate, and deeply human. That difference is what made the discovery so haunting. The public remembered Elvis as the electrifying young star who changed music, the performer in glittering jumpsuits, who could command an arena with a single movement. But these recordings appeared to offer something much more private. A man singing without the protection of the enormous image he had spent his life building. Some listeners interpreted the performance as an encounter with mortality. Whether that interpretation is fair or not, hearing Elvis's voice preserved in a room that had remained hidden for so long creates an extraordinary emotional connection to the past. And the recordings were only part of the mystery. The condition of the attic reportedly suggested that it had never been completely forgotten. The air conditioning system had continued operating, helping protect the belongings from the damaging effects of heat and humidity. The boxes were reportedly organized rather than scattered, and the objects appeared to have been deliberately preserved. That raises another question. Who kept watch over this hidden collection? Was it family? Trusted employees? Someone who understood that these possessions were too important to simply abandon? Whoever maintained the space left behind almost no public explanation, allowing the attic itself to become another chapter in the mystery surrounding Elvis. Yet perhaps the greatest revelation was that nothing supernatural was required to make the room extraordinary. The attic did not need to contain a secret hiding place, an impossible disappearance, or proof that Elvis had somehow survived. It contained something more believable, and in its own way, more powerful. It contained pieces of the man himself, his childhood memories, his military years, his books, his handwritten thoughts, his belongings, and, most hauntingly, his voice. For nearly 50 years, fans could only stare at the staircase and imagine what existed beyond it. Now, if these reported discoveries are accurate, the answer was not a single shocking object waiting in the darkness. It was an entire preserved fragment of Elvis's private world. And perhaps that is why the attic remained so fascinating for so long. The king of rock and roll had spent his life being watched by millions, yet the most intimate pieces of his story were hidden behind one locked door. So after all these years, the question may no longer be, who was inside Elvis Presley's attic? The real question is, how much of Elvis did the world never truly get to know? What do you think was the most shocking discovery inside Elvis Presley's attic? Share your thoughts in the comments, then watch another video on screen for more fascinating stories hidden behind the lives of legendary stars. Don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries, untold stories, and surprising discoveries.